In today's Art of Supply interview, I'm glad to welcome Tim Richardson back to the show. Tim is the founder and CEO of Iter Consulting. He's joined us in the past, and I'm glad that he's back here today. So, Tim, thank you so much for rejoining us here on Art of Supply.
Great to be with you.
Absolutely. Now, when you and I connected for the show last time, we were talking about similar topics, but it was all speculation. We spoke pre-presidential administration change in the United States. There was talk of tariffs, but certainly no concrete effects. How that was all going to roll down to supply chains was anybody's best guess. But
Yeah.
today we're going to start looking at some more specifics. Now, before we get into that, just to sort of qualify the perspective that you're coming from, for anybody that didn't catch that first interview, which I will share in the show notes of this one, can you just talk a little bit about your professional background and what your current focus is today?
Yeah. So my historic background is manufacturing industry, but probably for the last 25 years in a consultancy has been around kind of supply chain, global supply chain strategy, and bits of manufacturing, but largely supply chain strategy. So um, I think I'm coming up at the moment is really trying to understand the new world order, for want of a better
Right.
description, what that actually means to the way businesses think and act, and what difference it's making to their business.
And it's interesting because in you and I prepping to sort of come back and talk about all of the changes that we've seen, one of the interesting distinctions that came up is that while we talk a lot about supply chains, what we actually should be thinking about is supply networks. Can you
Yeah.
talk through the difference between those two ideas?
I guess a chain, in my mind, a chain is, yeah, it's the link from supply through, from demand through supply, but just through a single chain. Whereas I
Yeah.
think networks, I think we are significantly past post-globalization, as the impact of tariffs and some of the behaviors of moving capacity around the world, and we're kind of seeing that in every geography. People are now beginning to distribute their manufacturing, which is
Mm.
moving things closer to the source of the actual demand, which has got an environmental impact, positive one.
Mhm.
But I think as much as anything, it's trying to help businesses be more local for local, which is mitigating some of the impacts of some of the kind of the geopolitical tensions that are existing today.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, for anybody that's ever mapped a supply chain, nothing is a straight line. It's sort of like there's no
Yeah,
such thing as a totally level surface in a house, right? Once you start looking into the details, there's always going to be either bunches of suppliers or here's where it forks or here's where we see a difference. And because of that complexity, a lot of which is put in place on purpose for supply resilience or because it's someplace in that supply chain, some grouping of suppliers can provide something valuable and additional that's needed. How does that affect the challenge, or how well do companies know their actual supply network, do you think?
really, really poorly, I would say, is the honest answer. I think if you really were able to map it at great detail, and that's a gargantuan task
Yeah.
and really complex task to do that, and I think it's difficult to justify doing it because of there isn't the value that would come from it, but you would end up a real bowl of spaghetti. And I think there's some really simple examples. You're looking at the automotive industry between Canada and the States,
Mhm.
where you've got things going across the border 10, 12 times. And you've got the same within Europe, within Europe, country to country. All the time that was one free trade zone. Now the
Yeah.
UK is obviously, for Brexit, is outside of it. That suddenly becomes a lot more complicated and costly. And so I think some of it is planned, but a lot of it is accidental. It's
Mm.
kind of, you optimize each individual loop, and before you know it, the whole is not optimized. And I think
Yeah.
there's kind of a real challenge there.
And that too leads to the idea that we might talk about a company having a supply chain. But again, the devil's in the details. Once you get in, maybe at a high level, conceptually, the company has a supply chain, but it's really more like each product line, each assembly, potentially, depending on what you're doing. It's
Yeah, yeah.
actually all of these little supply chains that sort of come together at some point and then branch back out to get products or customers, it really does. There is so much complexity represented that we can't see when we're looking at all of this from a very high level.
No, you can't. But equally, particularly as we know, the premise of post peak globalization and now manufacturing being more distributed, actually you have to see it globally because that's the only place you can ultimately make the decisions about where your demand gets distributed through your various bits of manufacturing. Yes, you can put rules-based bits around that, but
Yeah,
if your facility in Europe is full and the one in the US is under, or in the Americas is underutilized, well, what do you do? How do you rebalance the supply between those? What's the impact on your overall margin? Lead time? It becomes very complicated very quickly, and you can't see that. It's very difficult to see that from a node within the network. You have to sit above the network and look across it in order to be able to make those kind of fully integrated decisions. And I think that changes the capability of supply chains, but also the nature of how they're controlled and managed.
yeah. And yet, the supply chains are really the result of lots of decisions, right? Each decision that a team makes about working with this supplier or working with these two suppliers in this area, it's built up still block by block. Given that, I
Yeah,
mean, unless you acquire an operation, right, you have piece by piece built that supply chain. Why is it so difficult to then look back from a higher level perspective and actually see the resulting structure of all of those individual decisions you've made?
because they are individual decisions. That's the point. They're individual decisions made over a time phase, and you make them with the best understanding, but you don't understand all the consequences of those, and therefore they. It's only when you try and take a step back and look at it, you realize how complicated something you have made.
Yeah.
Yeah, then periodically have to strip it back and kind of almost start again. Not, it's never as extreme as that, but
Of
effectively
course.
that's what you're trying to do. Yeah, conceptually that's what you're doing, I think. Yeah,
And
and
so
i
that
think i
brings
think
us
the
to that. Oh, go ahead and finish your thought. I'm sorry for
no,
interrupting.
what I was going to say was, and I think the bit of it building up bit by bit, it's quite difficult to understand where your risks lie in your supply chain as well, because I
Yeah.
think we may have said last time, but certainly the emerging thought in my mind is that, yeah, we've had this whole period of trying to manage supply chains for lowest cost. Whereas I think now we're managing for resilience
Yeah.
at a managed cost and an acceptable cost. But knowing where the risk exists is really quite difficult, especially if you've got multi-tier supply chains. Your risk could exist 3 or 4 tiers down in your supply chain,
Yeah.
and you don't really understand that. So I think there are some tools. I'm not desperately familiar with them or not expert at them, that kind of start to look into some of these and identifying where your risks live, even if
Yeah.
they're low down. Prime example, electronics industry. May have a specific electronic component that's 3 or 4 tiers down your supply chain, and yet it's only made in one factory in the world. And if that's in
Right.
Taiwan, which is quite likely, you have a kind of the existential risk that's associated with that. So yeah, it's interesting times to be in this world.
Yeah. It is interesting. And then when we think about both the challenge associated with trying to map supply chains in detail, but the potential ROI, because it sounds like what you're saying is, you know, because we've made all of these decisions, which were probably the very best for their little
Yeah,
siloed view of the world, but we've made them in isolation. And as a result, when you stick the whole system together, you actually don't have a great understanding of cost and risk, which are two things that seem very essential to the success of a
yeah.
business. So, does that benefit of really understanding how the whole supply chain comes together start to outweigh the extreme challenge we've talked about, which is mapping it and actually getting an understanding of it?
That's a really good question. And as you can tell by the pause, it's one probably I'm not quite sure where you balance that. So I think you probably only know the answer to that when it goes wrong,
Ah,
uh,
yep.
which I know isn't very helpful. But
And yet it's all the time. So
yeah, but
it's a
but but,
common
but
scenario.
I think Pareto I'm sure is alive and well in this environment
Yeah.
as well. So I think there is. yeah, you can never really understand the risks, however much effort you put into it. I'll illustrate a good example in Europe when sort of the Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah.
One of our clients had a factory in Lithuania, so they were on about 20 kilometers from the Belarusian border, which was clearly very tuned into the Russians.
Yeah.
And they'd done a huge amount of preparation on in case this did happen. But the one thing they hadn't thought was the fact most of the local drivers were Lithuanian, and they all went back to fight.
Ah,
So suddenly you couldn't move anything. So it's just a very simple example of however much effort you put into, there's always the unexpected risk. But having said that, I think you can, with reasonable efficiency, look into your supply chain and really
yeah.
identify what the core obvious risks are, because some of them are obvious. And when you've got another
Sure.
client who's got this one factory that feeds a whole number of other factories, and it's the only one that does what it does in the group, it's at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it doesn't take a genius to work that out. Yeah, so I think there are some. I think you can get a long way down the route by just a bit of common sense, a bit of structure,
Yeah.
a bit of detailed analytics without sort of trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah. Well, and of course, at the same time as everything is moving and shifting in response to global business conditions, you had mentioned earlier that, we're sort of past peak globalization at this point, and some things selectively are starting to either come closer to home or simply move where production is done.
Yeah.
From a sort of big picture perspective, where would you say we are today in terms of that trend of moving away from the point of peak globalization?
I think we're probably early days, and we still do see clients moving. Despite the tariff threats, we still do have clients that are moving capacity from the US out into Asia. So it's
Mhm.
not that it's completely stopped. Um, so we do still see people chasing lowest cost, and that's
Okay.
usually moving from out of China into other points in Asia. That's a mixture of mitigating the potential impacts of tariffs on China directly. And interestingly, quite a number of Chinese companies are doing that. So they are moving their source from China to Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia or somewhere like that. Um, so I think we're in that. I did another podcast with a guy, a professor, and we had this debate. And I said we're at an inflection point, and he argued we weren't quite at that point, but we could be.
Okay.
But we're not very far from that inflection point. So I think it's
Yeah.
in the early days. It's really in the kind of are we, aren't we? And I think the threat of tariffs that are coming from the US and the retaliatory ones that inevitably will come from
Yep.
some countries, I think that's forcing that issue. But I think it's a trend that was there already.
Yeah.
So things like the labor that was very cheap is not cheap anymore in Asia. The distribution as a proportion of spend is much greater.
Mm.
If you've got uncertainty in the supply chain routes, so actually your mitigation through inventory is greater, which runs risk of obsolescence, etc., etc. So the things that made it the right thing to do 10, 15, 20 years ago, that those whole dynamics have changed to some of the fundamentals. But
Sure.
actually, if you overlay the geopolitical instability that's there now, then you kind of see that as accelerating. But I think we're in early days. I think
Mhm.
my sense is certainly the European and the contacts I have in the US, the mindset is still very much based around the stability that existed up until probably COVID. There's a
Yeah.
really interesting stat I saw recently from, I think it was the New York, the Federal Reserve in New York, which was kind of showing the volatility of the supply chains from
Okay.
about 2000 on. Nice and stable, bit of a blip with the first financial crisis in 2007,
Yeah.
2008. COVID, post COVID, it's gone all over the place. And you've got COVID itself, you've got then the imbalance of supplies, you've then got Russia and Ukraine, you've got all that's going on in the Middle East, you've got ships going sideways in the Suez Canal, and it's
Mhm.
just one thing after another. And I don't think businesses have kind of really got their head around the fact that it's this volatility is the new normal, which makes the ability to work on a truly global supply chain quite as easy
Yeah.
and quite as attractive.
Yeah. As perhaps it was in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's interesting. You talked about the idea of geopolitics as an overlay. I actually think that's a really compelling way to look at it because it sort of, to me, in my mind, connects a little bit like we were just talking about mapping out a supply network versus conceptualizing a supply chain. The more detailed perspective you get, it's really hard, but it gives you a better
yeah,
understanding of what needs to be done. If we make the mistake at looking at the business conditions we're dealing with today and think to ourselves, oh, this is either short term disruption or it's
yeah,
completely caused by geopolitics or it's completely the fault of tariffs, we miss the fact that there is some cyclicality to what we're seeing. I mean, even just with the example of something like labor, right? You find a low cost country to source in, you start sourcing there. Eventually, salaries are going to go up because the competition raises, and then everybody moves sort
yeah,
of one to the left. If we don't force ourselves to have a granular understanding of which dynamics are driving different decisions in each part of the supply chain or region of the world, we're probably going to end up mixing a little bit of what's cyclical with a little bit of what's one-time short-term geopolitical, and it makes it a harder decision because you're not necessarily reading the right signals. Does that seem like a
yeah.
fair way to look at it?
I think that's a really good way of looking at it because I think there are various bits that are doing it, and I think there's another factor as well that yeah if all the industry that went from the west to the east, if you could put a magic wand and magically move it all back today,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have anywhere near the same kind of number of jobs, and they would be very different jobs. Simply because we've got lots of automation, we've got lots of robotics.
Yeah.
It isn't and the jobs that exist are no longer low skilled blue collar jobs. They're kind of highly skilled. I'm give a really, this is not a moving around, but it's a really simple example. In the UK, the mini factory that makes the mini is not a million miles from me. I've been around it a number of occasions, and one of my colleagues used to work there. And when he worked there, it was 350 people on a shift making the body in white, the shell.
Yeah.
Um, and they were all assembly workers. It's 1,200 robots now and
Okay.
about 80 people, and they're all process engineers. So they're all about the
Wow.
optimization. It's not the whole dynamic of what we manufacture has changed and how we make it has changed. So I think there's not that labor bit. Just moving for cheaper labor in most instances kind of isn't a very smart move
Yeah.
to do. It's very short term, and there's a bit of re-engineering your processes to be able to take this longer term strategic view. I
Yeah.
think it's intriguing. If I was in the US at the moment, and yeah, there is a pressure invariably to onshore your manufacturing. Well, yeah, is what's happening now, is that just a 4 year transient, and then it will be different in 4 years because it's going to take you that long to
Yeah.
move it or to move it well. So I think it's a really interesting, difficult set of decisions, and that's about
Yeah.
what's the transient, as opposed what's the fundamentals. And so my view is, if you're moving back to the US, you should be conscious of the transients, i.e., the tariffs bit, but
Yeah.
it's the fundament, some of the fundamentals that have changed.
Yeah.
Cost of
Well,
labor, yeah,
it is interesting too. And I'll sort of, I don't know, step out of character here and give you my perspective on that a little bit. I think it's very much like what we're talking about with trends and cycles versus more focused disruptions or geopolitical things.
yeah,
I think it very much depends on the industry, first of all, but also
yeah,
the value proposition for the consumer, right? So I think about from a regulatory standpoint, some of the things that are changing in the US around emissions. What is no longer going to be enforced either in California or nationwide around consumer passengers getting closer to being, more electric, or the same thing in the supply chain, right? Moving class eights, we're finding that that's supported by sort of an exhausted consumer demand for making the switch to these vehicles. So I think it's like the more difficult the changes to make, there needs to be more, I don't know, demand connections, right? That other piece also needs to be there. It can't just be inconvenient or difficult for the company that's trying to adjust to okay, for 4 years we do it this way, and then for 4 years we're going to do it that way. there has to be a lot more inputs and signals, I think, that ends up driving that choice. If it's not supported by consumer demand, like we saw, we see automotive manufacturers in the US starting to pull back from the percentage of their fleets that they're
Yeah,
switching over to electric because consumer demand has somewhat been met for a time. And so there's no need for them to sort of continue on this trend towards, 100% everything being electric. It's only
yeah,
financially viable for them to have a certain percentage of the fleet at a certain price point be electric. So it's like the more difficult it is to bring a supply chain back. I think you've talked about consumer electronics. That's an excellent example, right? The more difficult it is to bring it back around labor, around cost, around consumer demand, the more complex that decision is going to be to do so.
yeah. And also, the more marginal the benefits are going to be. So
Exactly.
it's a really, it is a, it's very easy to, well, very easy. It's easy to sit on these kind of discussions and pontificate about,
Yeah.
and make it very simple. It's a really nuanced,
Yeah.
complex decision. But there are some fundamentals, I think. I think,
Yeah.
the electric vehicle is that, the reality is we have to move that way. It will move that way. It may not move at quite the pace we thought,
Right.
and I think it's really interesting because in the UK, in Europe, certainly, you know, you not you were it's moved from we're not allowed to produce new non-electric vehicles from 2030, which has now
Yeah.
moved back to 2035. It's a completely irrelevant decision because actually the life cycle of designing a new car, getting it into the marketplace, is much more than 5 years. So actually, the
Yes.
5 years, their plans were already set to move
Yeah.
towards electrification. So it just means you might limp on some old models for another few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a client, I won't name, but is one of the very major automotive suppliers, and they've got a diesel engine factory in the UK, and that they are limping on their equipment for another 10 years because they're not going to reinvest.
Yeah.
So the fact you move it back 5 years, they're still not going to reinvest. They're just going to have to limp it on for another 5 years,
Yeah.
or just say, well, we're not going to produce diesel vehicles. So I think some of these things are irrevocably in
Yeah.
play.
And yet it's interesting because as we pontificate, as you said, we've very quickly left talking specifically about supply chains. And now we're talking about straight corporate strategy.
Yeah.
You and I were able to take that in one very small step. Do you find that the same thing is happening in the decision making process in the C suite? So, certainly during COVID and the few years that followed, it was, all supply chain all the time, top of mind. Is it still that way? Have C-suites learned and their perspective on the supply chain has stayed up to date in terms of how it influences some of these decisions, or have things started to sort of naturally relax and the supply chain has a little bit gone back to where it was maybe pre-2020?
I think we're somewhere between we were in COVID and 2020. I think, um, yeah, if we took pre 2020, it was seen very much as a cost to be minimized.
Mm,
In COVID, it was seen as strategically important. And I think we see somewhere between the two now. So I think my sense is there's a recognition that it is important, but only at the cost.
yeah.
It's kind of gone back to some significant degree to a cost to be managed.
Okay.
And I think there's another part of that particular coin, because if you look at the pool of talent that exists in the supply chain arena, the people that are in the senior positions they've grown up in a whole diet of minimizing cost.
Right.
So I think we find relatively few senior supply chain people that are able to operate at that true C-suite strategic level. That their whole paradigm is about how you can take cost out, which
Mm,
it absolutely is part of the job,
yeah.
but it's that and take the strategic view. And I see, unfortunately, I'm not sure I see in large part that capability of that breadth of talent to fulfill those roles.
Yeah.
So I,
Interesting. When we think about talent too and efficiency, so part of it is that background of how you focus, but now we've got the clash of sort of AI coming in terms
mhm.
of where the expectations are going around how you will automate a process or how you will take your analytics to the next level. Are you finding that that sort of background, which has kept most even senior supply chain leaders focused on a very cost-driven background, is it allowing them to be open to the possibilities of what AI can deliver? Is it still very early days there? How is that sort of shaking up the talent piece of it?
It's changing the dynamics of the talent piece unquestionably, and I think um, I say in my day, many years ago when I was in operational roles, planning
Mhm.
was it's just something anyone could do that. It's just a case of changing it around a bit and it'll get made.
Yeah.
It's become massively more analytic, and I think I'm going to put AI aside for a second. I think
Sure.
that was a trend that was on its way anyway. So I think the the people that are managing supply chains are much more analytic in nature. It is
Mhm.
a much more of an analytic job. Traditional businesses, a lot of them don't have that whole paradigm in place. So I think they still undervalue the role of scheduling, planning, forecasting, that
Yeah.
whole piece. Because when the world is as volatile as it has been, that becomes ever more critical.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the role of it's a whole new debate about the role of planning and where it sits, um, but I think so. I think it's changed the nature of the talent pool that is going to be there. But AI, there's clearly lots of AI forecasting tools, lots of AI huge claims that are being made.
Yeah.
I've agonized this a lot. I'm not sure whether it's just because I am the generation I am that I'm skeptical and cynical about this, or it's a valid cynicism, and I genuinely haven't got to a kind of a conclusion about it. But it seems to me that many of the organizations we run still can't run an ERP system effectively.
Yeah.
The base quality data is not there. The thinking that sits behind it is not there.
Yeah.
If you use that as your basis for trying to optimize using AI, it's just not going to work because the
Yeah.
quality of data is just really, really poor.
Yeah. And to your point
Yeah,
about
several times.
the thinking has to be there too, even if you had good data, to sort of get anything out of that process.
Yeah, it does, and I think people are I think people are more open to that, and I think that is definitely something that's in play.
Yeah.
I think it's still a science project at the moment. It's still being played with. I haven't seen anyone who's really taken it and really driven huge benefits from it. Lots of people are investing vast amounts of money, and we all even at a simple level, LinkedIn posts. It's very obvious when it's been written by AI.
Yes, it is.
And people there's so little trust that exists anyway that actually it runs the danger in the short term of
Yeah.
undermining even what trust does exist. So I suspect we've over the hyped the reality for the short term and underestimated its impact in the long term, which
Yeah.
yeah, dot com boomer 20 of the
Right.
millennia, it was going to change the world tomorrow. Well, it has changed the world, and it's changed it more profoundly than we predicted then,
Yeah.
but it just took longer. So I think we're probably in the hype is ahead of the reality, but the reality will be stronger than we think.
Yeah.
But it will change. And I think what my mind, the more I think about it, I think the organisations that are already in the best shape, it will just accelerate their competitive advantage. It will create yet
Mhm.
another gap with the best and the rest.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's
Now,
another very interesting dynamic. But it's playing out in the background, I would say, at the moment, to me,
yeah.
to what we're seeing.
Given all of the changes and the shifts that you and I have talked about today, if I could somehow tell you I had the power, Tim, I am going to put you in charge of supply chain at any company in the world. Now, you don't necessarily have to name a company. I think what I'm most interested in, given what we're going through today and trying to adapt to, would you rather work for a large company that is financially sound and has a lot of reach and a ton of resources? Or would you rather work for a more cash strapped, smaller organization that has the ability to sort of flex and adapt with some of what we're seeing?
So that's not an easy question to answer. It's not easy because
Which is good because I
um,
don't actually have that power. So there's a little less pressure on your answer than you,
well, that's okay
than
then.
you might have thought.
I would say intellectually the big company that's got lots of untapped. almost infinite resources because there's loads that can be done.
Yeah.
At a personal level, I would go for the smaller company because I think they're innovative, and that's my whole paradigm in the world. Yeah, I love the agility that gets in. And I think there's, there, as well as the best bit growing from the rest, I think there'll be new entrants, some real disruptors that will
Yeah.
come in traditional industries, and they'll have the agility and the vision and because they don't have the historic baggage of lots of data, they
Right.
will they will rapidly accelerate. So I think I don't think the cash. I think the ones that are in the evolving industries that are kind of going to be the disruptors of the future. That's where I would want to be.
Yeah. And when we start to think about being a disruptor of the future, or even for a supply chain team today that will take them to well-funded, well-staffed supply chain teams, right? In large enterprises, when we try to escape the idea of incremental change or responsive adjustments, and we actually want to think about having strategies or driving change that is significant enough that it has the ability to move the dial on supply chain impact. It's not a few percent, it's a completely different way. What is the level of change? How different does our approach need to be to get beyond incremental based on the conversations you're having with customers, or what you're seeing play out in the press? How can we challenge ourselves to think beyond, okay, I'm just going to handle this disruption well, but instead of thinking that way, think, okay, I'm going to completely shift the paradigm of how my supply chain works and what it does for the company so that we feel differently about these disruptions in the future? What do we have to be willing to try and carry out to make that possible?
I think it's both. I think the incremental change of what you've got, the world has changed sufficiently that's if you're working, if it's a global business, then
Yeah.
that's not going to work anymore.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to optimize the wrong things. You're trying to do the wrong things better. So I think the structure, the dynamics of your supply chain is the absolute critical game changer, and that will change fundamentally the control points, how you manage your supply chain, how you balance supply and demand. And then those are big complex questions that go through. I think what will happen is that factories will become closer to dumb factories, and the control points will
Yeah.
exist more centrally. And your role is to do what I tell you to do, and do it efficiently. So how you schedule your factory, how you optimize your factory. Yep, but that's what I want, and that's when I want it. You're not to challenge where the demand is coming from and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's a pretty fundamental shift. But the responsibility that exists within the um, the company when it designs the structure of its supply chain, it has to build in resilience and has to foresee some of the changes that are going to happen.
Yeah.
So a kind of a SNOP IBP time frame, there you're able to, oh, the tariffs have moved here, or this is happening there, so we can move demand around and supply around and change the linkages. So I think there's a need to have much more fluid supply chains, but still keep control of your cost.
Yeah.
So that requires a fundamental design to be based around that to enable that to happen. But the technology exists to do that. There's the way that even if we put AI aside, some of the the control and supply chain planning tools allow you to do that, some of that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's lots of things that allow us to do that, but it does, you think your way to success rather than act your way to success,
Yeah.
but it's built on this solid platform. There's a really good example of it's a very, very major food manufacturer who have said we're using planning for longer term. Actually, we recognize that the instability that exists in the short term. So our whole strategy is
Oh,
around agility.
interesting.
So rather than planning the short term, they're saying, yeah, of course, there's a degree of planning, but basically their ability to cope with changes in demand is all about making sure they've built the agility into their supply chain to allow it to respond to what they can't foresee in something they can a non-plannable timescale.
Yeah.
And the planning is about the longer term and so on and so forth. So I think there's some of these really interesting distinctions that are coming through.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I enjoy having you on. I love the fact that we can have these conversations where we're sort of half dealing with what's currently happening that we know and half pushing ourselves to think beyond that. I love the insight that you bring in from some of the clients that you're working with. It makes these seem not so much like problems or challenges, but energizing opportunities.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think it's if ever there's a time to be in my long career, this is the most interesting time to be in supply chain, without doubt.
Absolutely. So, given that that's the case, Tim, if people didn't happen to catch your last interview, but did catch this one, first of all, they're going to go back and watch the other one. I promise that. But how should they connect with you, learn more about Iter Consulting? What is the best way for people to reach out and connect?
Well, you can either you can kind of get hold of me directly through the email. So tim.richardson@iterconsulting.co.uk. You can go through the website, iterconsulting.com. And I'm sure you find me on LinkedIn and just reach out, and I can talk about this stuff for hours. You can probably guess. So I'm not about necessarily wanting to sell consultancy to start with, but more than happy to have the conversation with anyone who wants to have it.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thank you for giving some of that time to us. I appreciate you being here, and I'm positive this is not the last time that you and I are going to connect.
Sounds great. Thank you, Kelly.